there's really a worldwide power struggle. Uh, there's a worldwide power struggle going on that will, frankly, determine the course of the next 2 or 3 generations. And it all has to do with the transition to the global south. It has to do with whether or not the owners and controllers of global financialized capital will be contained or will dominate in a new, updated version of the same type of ruthless imperialism and colonization that we've known for the last century or more. The countries of BRICS, particularly China, Russia, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, are actively trying to steer the trajectory away from this sort of domination. But the OCGFC are predatory by nature. They're predatory by nature. Their preference is always going to be to subjugate, to enslave, to exploit, and to pillage. That will always be their preference. That will always be their first choice if they can do it. They have to be convinced by one way or another that this choice is not optimal, that the thing that they want isn't possible. If they can find a way around negotiating and compromising, then they will. They'll never stop. They'll never stop trying to find those ways, ways that will allow them to pillage. So look, South Africa, as I warned about several weeks ago, before the election, it has been now undermined by means of what can only be called a soft coup, an electoral sabotage. But I don't only mean by means of rigged elections, but by comprehensive subversion, manipulation, and infiltration of their domestic political landscape by the United States. The so-called Democratic Alliance, the DA, which has been supported by outsiders, by the West, by the National Endowment for Democracy, and so on, by Western private sector power, collaborating with private sector power in South Africa, has now been able to move its way into a ruling coalition with the ANC. Okay, the DA is anti-BRICS. It's pro-Zionist. They represent the colonizer class and colonizer interests. I think that what happened in South Africa is tremendously important and tremendously dangerous for the entire BRICS project, because it reveals the very clear intent, in my opinion, of the owners and controllers of global financialized capital to revive and to restore colonial control by any and every means available to them, and to subvert the economic sovereignty and political independence of the global south, if they can. Like I said, if they can find ways to do it, that's what they'll do. There's a new Cold War happening. It's a Cold War that's happening right now. And I think that we're seeing espionage and covert operations and political intrigues, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1950s, 1960s. At this point, I don't feel confident, to be honest, about any so-called democratic elections in any countries in the global south, except that they will be tampered with. And in fact, not only in the global south, in places like Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, and so forth. Same thing. South America, obviously, this is also happening. This is especially going to be the case in any country that operates according to a parliamentary system, because they're very easy to manipulate and tamper with. I think that BRICS should draft a uniform policy that requires all member states, or at least encourages all member states, to ban the National Endowment for Democracy from funding any political party or any NGO in their countries. And you can add to that USAID as well, USAID. But I don't think it's wise or safe for any BRICS nation to allow domestic organizations or domestic political parties to be funded by the United States in any way whatsoever. They're only going to be used to manufacture opposition or to manipulate real existing opposition towards their own ends, against the interests of that country. So that needs to be stopped, in my opinion. There are moves and counter-moves going on non-stop. The situation is fluid. While there's no doubt in my mind that the global south will rise, it's not at all clear who's going to be in control of the global south when all is said and done. The global south will rise, but who's going to be managing that, we don't know yet. The economy is shifting, there's no question. But those who have been controlling the global economy up until now want to maintain their control during and after the transition takes place, during and after the pivot. How that's all going to turn out is up in the air right now. And it's being determined, that outcome is being determined by decisions that are being made now. The most dangerous situation is in Africa, because of course Africa is absolutely the most important continent on the planet, the most important continent to the planet. And the next most important, and therefore the next most at-risk region, is the Middle East. The Middle East and Africa power the whole global economy. They power everything that makes so-called modern life possible. It's all made possible by the Middle East and Africa. And if the West was an actually civilized civilization, that would mean that peace and stability in the Middle East and in Africa should be of paramount importance. Good relations and harmonious dealings and so on, that would be the priority if they were civilized people. But of course, the West is not civilized. And if you have something that they need, if you have something that they want, but especially if you have something that they need, then they do not see you as a friend. They don't see you as a friend that they want to be close to and have good relations with. They see you as an enemy that they want to subjugate. They see the world in a predator-prey paradigm, kill or be killed mentality. They're the original extremists, and they've never grown out of it. So, for instance, look at Sudan. Sudan is strategically vital for the West, not only for oil, gold, and minerals and so on, but for agriculture. They want Africa to feed them. They want Africa to feed the West, even if Africans have to starve so that Westerners can be fed. In fact, if Africans starve, they'll be assured because it means that the food is going to them, which is what they want. And again, they approach the world with the mentality that someone has to starve, someone has to be enslaved, someone has to be exploited, and as long as it's you, they're happy. You have to understand this mindset. This is the mindset of the West. This is their mentality. It's a zero-sum mentality, an extremist mentality. That's how they approach the world. That's how they approach politics, economics, everything. Anything you have is something that they're being denied. That's how they think. You're not supposed to have anything because they're supposed to have everything. Now, the United Arab Emirates backed the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan in an attempt to take over the government because they were afraid that they would lose influence in Sudan if a civilian democratic government got elected, which was in the works. And the UAE has been positioning itself for years now as a broker for everyone's interests. And that's what they were doing in Sudan. They wanted to be a broker for everyone's interests, as opposed to the West dominating Sudan, or China dominating Sudan, or Russia dominating Sudan. They wanted to dominate Sudan and manage everyone else's stake in Sudan. They wanted to be the middleman. I talked about this all the way back when the attempted coup first took place. I said, and I think it's been borne out over time, that everyone was aware of what the UAE was doing. The Americans were aware, the Europeans were aware, the Russians and the Chinese. Everyone was aware, and everyone approved of what the UAE was doing at that time. For the Russians and for the Chinese, and I think for Saudi Arabia as well, their approval was conditional on the coup succeeding and stability being secured and restored quickly. The Americans and the Europeans, well, they approved because either way they could benefit. If the coup succeeded, then they could do business with the UAE. They could mitigate some of China's and Russia's influence by means of the UAE, and they could protect their own interests. But if the coup failed, then for them, the country can fall into chaos and violence, and that's fine. Because if that happens, then China's and Russia's interests would be undermined anyway, which is mostly what they wanted. And they could push for the war in Sudan to escalate until eventually Sudan could be divided yet again, after they had already successfully divided the South from the country. Now the West could be broken off. So for them, it's a win-win. If the coup works, they win, and if the coup doesn't work, they win. And of course, this is how it's gone. Everyone talks about India being the potential spoiler of BRICS, but in my opinion, the UAE is more dangerous to the BRICS project than India is, even if unintentionally. Because, in my opinion, Mohammed bin Zayed seems to want to emulate the Western colonizer strategy of violence and the strategy of divide and conquer, which is completely at odds with the whole ethos and the whole approach of BRICS. Whether he knows it or not, I think, in my opinion, he's absolutely playing into the hands of the West by backing the RSF. I mean, not only is the UAE pushing Sudan towards balkanization. He's feeding the monster of Arab-African animosity that the CIA has spent millions of dollars trying to foment for years. This is absolutely the last thing that they should be doing. As I said, because the Middle East and Africa are the most important regions on earth. And solidarity and unity between the Arab world and Africa needs to be cultivated. It needs to be fortified. It needs to be strengthened. The UAE is the biggest foreign investor in Africa, more than 3 times Chinese investment. As much as you hear about Chinese investment in Africa, the UAE invests more. It's nearly 10 times the amount of American investment in Africa. And they're doing that precisely because they understand how important Africa is. But with what they're doing in Sudan, well, no one's going to see them as friends. No one's going to see them as allies or partners. They're going to see them as invaders, as usurpers, and who can blame them? What happened in the South African elections was a win for the West. And what's happening in Sudan is also a win for the West, whether the UAE knows it or not. These are among the moves and counter moves I was talking about. The thing that will determine whether the transition to the global South actually results in the economic sovereignty and political independence of the global South, or whether it results in further subjugation and pillage, the thing that will determine that is BRICS. I mean, the UAE has been incredibly strategic in building their power and building their autonomy over the last 30 years. But their actions in Sudan can undo everything that they've achieved. And they can, by what they're doing in Sudan, they could potentially sink BRICS before it's even properly set sail. They can sink it at the dock. Now, I know that there will be, the usual suspects online who think that their biases are the same thing as information and analysis. And they'll take what I'm saying as a validation of their own prejudice and hatred against the UAE. And they'll take it as a validation of their wrong assumption that the UAE is a Western puppet. But no. When you try to spread animosity against the Muslim countries, you're just as bad as the RSF, in my opinion, in terms of your contribution to undermining BRICS, in terms of undermining Muslim economic sovereignty and political independence, and in terms of you helping to advance Western colonizer agendas. And that's really my point here. What happened in South Africa highlights how perilous the situation is right now, and how perilous it's going to be for a number of years, and thus how important it is for us to act and to speak with discipline and with solidarity. I'm saying what I'm saying about Sudan as a nasiha to the UAE, because the policy that they're pursuing in Sudan is criminal, it's wrong, and it's incredibly short-sighted politically. I don't want to see the BRICS project undermined by what they're doing. I don't want to see their own project of expanding their sphere of influence. I don't want to see that fall apart, because that's a project that has the potential to, in my opinion, that's a project that has the potential to benefit the entire Muslim world. And by benefiting the Muslim world, it will benefit everyone else as well. Look, morally, what they're doing in Sudan is reprehensible. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. That's not open to question. But my opinion is that what they're doing in Sudan is also politically counterproductive. I would strongly advise that they immediately switch their support away from the RSF and back the Sudanese army. And they should convene serious negotiations, peace talks, for the disarming and the disbanding of the RSF and the surrender of its leaders. And then they should pour investment into Sudan. Pour investment into Sudan. Both to try to make right the wrong that they've done, but also to help secure the influence that they wanted, but through soft power. That's the way they need to do it, through soft power. Not through military power, not through militias. Because look, right now the truth is that the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but especially Saudi Arabia, they hold the keys to the liberation of the global South and the Muslim world. They really do, truly. Their relationships with the other BRICS countries, with Russia, with China, with Iran, with India, and how they manage their relationships with not only Western governments, with the US and Europe, but also with the Western private sector powers, with the Western OCGFC. How they manage all of that can basically determine whether the Middle East and whether Africa will become a theater of colonizer bloodshed and chaos, or whether it will ascend to global economic, political, and cultural powerhouses, which it should be. The Middle East and Africa should be economic, political, and cultural powerhouses in the world. They'll determine whether the Middle East and Africa will be the stable center of the world, or whether they will, both regions will just become a plantation of slavery and carnage. And we need to actually firmly support these countries for that reason, and their governments. They're under unimaginable pressure. So if you're one of those people who's spreading Zionist propaganda against the Muslim governments, Western propaganda, in my opinion, and I've said this many times, you're literally collaborating with the enemies against the Muslims and in support of Western colonization, Western colonialism, and Western hegemony. You're collaborating with all of that if you're attacking the Muslim governments and you're spreading their propaganda. Look, the BRICS project is not bulletproof. The outcome is not guaranteed. What they're doing is fraught with peril. There's an incalculable number of moving parts in what they're trying to do. And most of those parts are being coordinated and are being synchronized brilliantly. And our countries are consistently, especially over the last 8 months, they're consistently outmaneuvering the West. But they're vulnerable and they're imperfect, and they're sailing in uncharted waters. So that, there's no guarantee that they're going to succeed. But I want them to succeed. And you should want them to succeed. So Arab-African solidarity is a must. And Muslim unity is a must. And Muslim unity includes unity between the Muslim peoples, the Muslim populations, and the Muslim governments. Because again, we're living in a very treacherous period with colonizer covert destabilization campaigns, manipulation, and subversion appearing across the global south and across the Muslim world, across the Arab world. The elections in South Africa are just the latest example of that. But we see examples all the time. So yes, legitimate criticism should only ever take the form of nasiha. And in order for the criticism to be legitimate, the first criteria is that it has to be based on whether or not the goal of that criticism is actual correction and improvement for strengthening the position of our governments, the moral position, and improving their position strategically. If the goal is to just undermine or overthrow the governments, then the criticism is illegitimate, even if the grievance is valid, even if the grievance is true. And that's the other criteria. Obviously, the criticism has to be actually based on factual reality. It has to be true. So you have to be telling the truth, and you have to be telling the truth for the purpose of helping our governments be better, morally and strategically better. But what I'm seeing more often than not is illegitimate criticisms based on false colonizer propaganda expressed and spread for the sole purpose of undermining our governments. The Arab Spring was more than 10 years ago, and whether we want to believe that that movement was organic or manufactured, or a bit of both, there's no question that the Arab Spring was utilized by the colonizers. The colonizers executed Saddam Hussein, executed Gaddafi, and plunged Syria and Libya into war. So we can see practically that there's very little difference in terms of outcome between a Western military invasion and a popular uprising or protest movement in the Muslim world. The outcome in either case is misery and subjugation by the West. Okay, objectively, both Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi were dictators. Yes, sure. And also, objectively, things were immeasurably worse after them. Sudan's overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, as I warned about prior to it happening years ago, it's been massively destabilizing for Sudan. We wouldn't be where we are now in Sudan had that not happened, had they not overthrown Omar al-Bashir. Look, the lines are very clear. The sides are very clear in this struggle. And they're very clear because we know the way the West thinks. Predator and prey. It's the predator-prey mentality. So if you are not firmly and uncompromisingly on the side of the Muslims, the Muslim countries, and yes, the Muslim governments, then you are on the side of the predatory West, plain and simple. And if you want to be on the side of the global South, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, then you should be on the side of the Muslim countries. And you should be on the side of the Muslim governments, because BRICS is simply not going to work without them. And the global South will not gain sovereignty. The global South will not gain sovereignty, and it will not gain independence without the Muslim states, without the Muslim governments. And no one is going to be able to stop the colonizers except the Muslims, period. No one will be able to do it except for us. You know, it's amazing to me that you have the same people, you know, you'll find this, the same people who will berate and who will condemn Muslim governments as hypocrites, and yet they have no hesitation themselves about allying with Marxists, Leninists, communists, atheist left-wingers, or with white supremacist, anti-Semitic, evangelical right-wingers. But somehow they can't condescend to support Muslim rulers. I mean, it's absurd. They're really just useful idiots for the colonizers, honestly. So when I talk about the UAE and Sudan, it's the same as me talking about the election tampering in South Africa. I'm talking about moves that endanger the BRICS project, the project for economic sovereignty and political independence of the global South, because I want that to succeed. And I'm not criticizing for the sake of criticizing. You know, I'm not criticizing because I'm trying to bring down or to berate the government of the UAE. No. The success and the stability of the UAE is crucial. And I think what they're doing in Sudan is detrimental in many ways to that success and to that stability. I mean, they could face criminal charges at the ICC for what they're doing in Sudan, let's be honest. But at the same time, they're doing many positive things. But the Sudan crisis can tear all of that apart. It can destroy everything they've worked on. So this is nasiha. And I think that Muslims need to realign themselves with Islamic norms instead of with Western norms. And they need to realize that, okay, for the West, because their leaders anyway view the population as enemies in the democratic West, you have protest. That's the go-to for political activism. But for Muslims, we have nasiha. We have sincere advice. You know, in the democratic West, the default relationship between the people and the government is antagonistic. But that's not supposed to be our relationship with our leaders. As I said, the situation is incredibly dangerous. We're living through a moment now that will determine the trajectory of global power dynamics for the next several generations. We have to take that seriously. You know, these Westerners are getting panicked, and they're getting desperate, and they're capable of doing desperate and extreme things. Burning a house down is a lot easier and a lot faster than building one. And the Muslim countries and the countries of the global South, the economies of the global South, they're trying to build their houses in a neighborhood of arsonists. That's a very delicate undertaking. But we have these people, you know, wannabe activists, self-righteous wannabe activists, people who think that they're shedding light when what they're really doing is lighting fires. You know, someone sent me a story the other day about a journalist in Jordan who was arrested and who was jailed in Jordan, and who obviously Western human rights groups are now advocating for this journalist to be freed. And this person who sent it to me asked me, why would Jordan arrest a journalist to stop her from reporting the truth about Palestine? Clearly indicating that he himself had completely believed the colonizer propaganda narrative. You know, she was arrested for telling the truth. No. She was arrested literally for publishing debunked Zionist propaganda that was intended to slander the government of Jordan and to incite opposition against the government of Jordan. That's why she was arrested. What do you think was going to happen? They're going to give her a balloon? Look, these are psyops. This is agitprop against the Arab and the Muslim governments, precisely because they are not Western puppets. And even more so because they're not Western puppets anymore. And they're making independent and defiant choices. They're making independent and defiant moves that the West does not like. You think that these rulers are Western puppets, while the West is actively trying to foment rebellion and topple them. I said you're blind. And the first one that they would like to topple is MBS. That's the first one that they'd like to topple. The main one who this type of person foolishly believes is a Western puppet, even though he joined BRICS, dropped the petrodollar agreement, reconciled with Iran, snubbed the G7 in favor of going to the BRICS summit, and has been factually the strongest and most insistent leader demanding a Palestinian state. It's absolutely transparent what the West is doing. And it's transparent why they're doing it. And yet there are Muslims who will go along with it against our own interests. And that's why I say, if you are blind to reality, then you should also be mute about it. Because the situation is too serious for political tourists to come into the public discourse just to recite the travel brochure about the region that was printed for them by Washington and Tel Aviv. You know, people who want to bring Western-style anti-establishment protests to the Muslim world because all you're doing is serving Western interests when you do that, whether you know it or not. If the only way that you can pass the day without lying is by being silent, then be silent. Because when you speak without knowledge, well, an uninformed opinion is nothing but a lie at the end of the day. So it's better for you in the dunya, it's better for your dunya, and it's better for your akhirah to keep silent. If you can't channel your emotion, channel your anger, your heartbreak, your angst about the situation in Gaza or Sudan or wherever else, if you can't channel that energy, that emotional energy, into doing research and critically following news and events to educate yourself about reality, then you don't actually care enough about the situation to make yourself useful. And all of your anger and your heartbreak and your angst are all just nothing but narcissistic exercises to make everything about you and your feelings. Well, we'd all appreciate if you would just journal about it instead of intrude on serious public discourse.